Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eric Tinsay Valles, and I'm with my co-editor, Desmond, and we're here for the reading for the Atelier of Healing, Poetry about Trauma and Recovery. And this project has been on for about 2 years, and we're honored tonight to have very eminent poets from all over the world who are sharing their masterpieces and their life experiences with us.
Yeah.
And Desmond will be showing some snatches from the website that is about to be launched at the Poetry Festival, Singapore.
All right. Just very quickly, let me just show you what we've come up with. This is the homepage of this anthology. It became an e-anthology, a web anthology, because clearly with the situation around the world, having a print product would be well, somewhat difficult to get around. But we have a couple of chapters, and if you look at the design, there's a lot of blue in it, right? But somehow all the lovely poems seem to find their way into a certain chapter and belong there. So we're very happy that it all came together nicely, quite effortlessly. If we go all the way into one of the chapters, say the first chapter, you'll see that we have actually paired certain poets, certain authors together, almost as if they are put in conversation with each other and their poems are in conversation. And so altogether, we've got over 100 writers writing about very different experiences of trauma, of hurt, of pain, and of healing, and their own journeys. And it's just been absolutely spectacular to have such diverse narratives within this anthology. All right. And
we've actually received a lot of hits so far online. And there are some writers out there who would like to be part of this anthology, even if the submission has been closed.
Yes, for a very long time. The submission's been closed. So lots of contributors here from all over the world, and you know, if people watching were to just click on the names, they would just get the poems immediately, right? And of course, we've got lots of people to thank, like Poetry Festival Singapore, that is giving us a space to launch this with all you wonderful international writers reading, so that everyone all over the world can hear your voices, and some other events lined up as well. All right, so without further ado, Eric, shall we start off our first reader all the way from Hawaii? Yeah, we have Joseph Stanton, the wonderful Joseph Stanton, and let me have the honors of introducing Joseph Stanton. Joseph Stanton has published 6 books of poems. They're titled Moving Pictures, Things Seen, Imaginary Museum, A Field Guide to the Wildlife of Suburban Oahu, Cardinal Points, and What the Kite Thinks. His other sorts of books include Looking for Edward Gorey, The Important Books, Stan Musial, a biography, and a Hawaii anthology. His poems have appeared in lots of journals, including Poetry, New Letters, Antioch Review, Harvard Review, New York Quarterly, and many other journals. All right. So let's welcome dear Joseph Stanton. Joseph, it's all yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yes, we can.
Yes, both my poems were written in response to a hospital stay from some years ago. After a serious operation, I was recuperating and reflecting on my situation. Both poems stem from the feelings I had at that time. I was in pain and I had a few fears, but I was hopeful and looking towards recovery. The first poem is actually the printed here in the second spot, but Warning Doors Alarmed has to do with something I think lots of us have seen on doors within buildings that tell us that we should not try to exit by that door because an alarm will go off. But I took that as kind of a symbolic thing for something about my situation. So let me read that poem first. Warning, door is alarmed. In the post-op days of my hospital stay, they helped me shuffle down the corridors to restore some of what has gone away, my natural knacks, my bodily mechanics. I seem an absurdly hobbled version of myself, exuding more tubing than a VCR. To be fully alive again seems unlikely, a goal elusive, mocking, ever out of reach, like a door at the far end of a hall that I creep towards for what seems like decades as it recedes, taking with it its anxious message, that it is alarmed, that it is ready to scream. Yeah, I tell the door when I finally get there, me too. So the other poem I'm going to read has to do with a bird that we have in Hawaii. It's a white tern. It's a city bird as well as a seabird. And it's quite remarkable, a beautiful bird. They go out to sea and fish for tiny, look for tiny fish that they scoop up and they bring back to their nest. They lay their eggs actually just in the crooks of branches. They don't even make nests. And then they, once they've have their chicks come out, they do these sort of balletic flights all around these tall trees. It's quite remarkable and beautiful to see. And of course, people in Honolulu have fallen in love with these birds. It's become the bird of the city of Honolulu. And of course, when you're in a hospital, you can look out the window and you can watch these remarkable flights of these birds kind of celebrating, it looks like, their own freedom or the own beauty of their flight. So anyway, that was what inspired me to write this poem, White Terns. Outside the hospital window at dawn, I watch in pain a pair of white terns weave their intricate ballet over, in, and around the huge monkey pods and banyans. They sail exquisitely echoing lines, the second bird playing tune and variation on the path of the first, again and again, until finally they settle into leaves. But no, there they go again, soaring. Later in the morning, I hobble back to my window. They are long gone, off to the sea for dangerous divings for the small fish that are their living. Birds of the sea and of the city, their lines of flight explain how one thing can follow another in a lovely way, with a turn behind a twist, a rise after a decline. Thank you. Those are my poems.
Lovely.
Great.
Lovely, Joseph. Thank you so much for the wonderful read. So Joseph, this anthology just looks at the relationship between poetry and its capacity to be a healing art. Do you have any thoughts about what it was like, just being in that space of grappling with illness, and then also deciding to attend to that poetic mind and heart that you've had all your life, right? What was it like, to go to poetry again, right?
Well, my White Terns poem actually came out in my book, A Field Guide to the Wildlife of Suburban Oahu. One thing I think about, nature is that basically it's all these kind of creatures we have all around us, not necessarily exotic creatures, but everything from little lizards so I think observing the world, really seeing all these creatures, even if they are mundane and boring little things, are really important. And in fact, most of us in a place like Oahu, we live in a kind of suburb. Some people complain, why do you call your book suburban? And I think, well, actually, that's just the reality that kind of most of us don't live in the midst of a city here. We live on the outskirts. But I think just noticing all these creatures, however minor or small they are, is just an important thing. And then warning, the door is alarmed. I think my feeling there is that one needs to have a sense of humor about stuff, and that there are all kinds of things that one can notice. There are little ironies that play around the world, and so one can't take one's own misery too seriously. That that, so I think that awareness of the larger world with its creatures on the one hand, and then a sense of just laughing at oneself, or just laughing at the little ridiculousnesses of being sick. It's, why not laugh at that? I mean, it's better than the opposite.
Lovely,
Yeah, and
lovely.
Joseph, how privileged you are to be surrounded by rich nature where you are. And that
Yeah,
must be one of the best places in the world for recovering from illness.
it's nice. I mean, you have the pretty much we have nice weather all year.
Mhm.
Right now we're in the hurricane season. I hope not, knock on wood. But yeah, things are lovely here, and so it's good. But I think things are lovely everywhere. I mean, when I used to live in places where there was lots of snow, there's something beautiful about that too. To look out the window and see remarkable formations of snow or whatever. So I think really any place. I'm actually a lover of New York City. I know one of you is there, and I think that it's quite remarkable to be in such an exciting urban environment as that. So I think there's something to be enjoyed everywhere, and at least to be observed and to take note of in interesting ways.
Thank you.
So you have this childlike sense of wonder at your environment. How wonderful.
It's good. Yeah, why not? Why not enjoy it?
Thank you for the wisdom, pure wisdom, Joseph. All right, we're going to, and thank you for the lovely poems, Joseph. Next up, we've got Hedy Habra, who is going to
Yes.
read poems without accompanied text, because we want to hear her close up. And Eric, can you do the honors of introducing
Yeah,
Hedy?
sure. It's my great honor to do that. I've known Hedy for some time, and we're almost very close friends on Facebook. It's also my first time to see her on screen. Hedy is quite prolific. She has authored 3 poetry collections. Most recently, The Taste of the Earth, winner of the 2020 Nautilus Silver Award, and honorable mention for the 2020 Eric Hoffer Award. Tea in Heliopolis won the Best Book Award and was a finalist for the International Book Award. And Under Brushstrokes was a finalist for the Best Book Award and the International Book Award. And she's been a 16-time nominee for the Pushcart Prize and the Best of the Net. Her website is hedyhabra.com. And she also publishes in countless journals. There's one probably every month in which her work appears. And we're all excited to hear her very scenic poems. So Hedy, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for your kind words. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to finally get to see you and Des. I'll be reading a couple of poems out of the anthology. And the first is titled Obsessive Compulsion and is based on an accident, a serious accident that happened to my son in California, and I live in Michigan. So it was aggravated by the fact that it takes a couple of days to get tickets and get there. And it was a difficult poem to write because for a long time, I almost also had a hard time writing poetry. So finally, the way that the poem came to life was when I wrote it as though it had happened to someone else. So it's obsessive compulsion. I knew a woman who spent hours in front of her magnifying mirror, chasing split hairs like a huntress. She'd enter the intricacy of parallel lines, watch forking tips grow into reeds, swelling into bamboo shoots painted in Chinese ink over transparent rice paper, through which she saw her son falling from a cliff, light as a clipping. He lies at the bottom of the dark ravine, his foot severed, chuk, 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 criss-cross, cuts the slightest twist. He's being raised with pulleys. In a fog, she wanders in deserted streets, unable to find her way back. She'd forgotten her own name, thinking of her son's severed foot bleeding, his thick, fragrant blood, an oddity in the night scented with rosemary and lavender. She thinks of mountain lions, coyotes, a jugular vein prey to canines sharper than shears, hears feline raspy tongues licking the wound, refuses to see the man's body tremble, the tense hardening of muscles prior to rigor mortis that would come so fast. Yes, he shouldn't suffer, she prays. Eyes closed, finds herself back in front of her bathroom mirror, holding the scissors, holding her breath. Yes, it was only an illusion, and her son was recovering now, with nails stuck into his leg. Surgeons cleaned the wound 9 hours long. Gloved hands cut, chuk, chuk, sawed scraps, sewed back tissues and bones. The rest of him whole, chuk, chuk, chuk. The crisscrossing cuts the slightest deviance. None will escape. Crisscross she aims, tinkers with precision.
Great.
And the second poem I'll be reading is a prose poem, and it is about a dear friend of mine who spent a long time taking care of her ailing husband. And the poem's title is The Ages of Man. She lives with a man she now softly calls a living dead, fingers covering her lips like a feathered fan. She barely proffers these words, feels trapped, yes, as walls shrink around her, getting closer each day. She who never had children is nursing her no longer lover, always by his side, rubbing his failing limbs, calming his speeding pulse. He has aged so much after his illness, she thinks, watches how his skin fails to wrap the bones, hanging in places like the folds of a handed-down garment. He suddenly awakens at night anguished, fears the Sandman, needs to lie next to her and hold her hand. She dreams of opening the door wide open, of stepping out to the light, to an uninterrupted sleep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hedy. For trauma poems, those are very beautifully written. And it's both poems and many of your other works tend to have dreamy landscapes. Is that intentional on your part?
I think I can't help it.
I can't help. Wait,
Yes,
is it probably the artist in you that shows itself in the way you paint these traumatic experiences with very precise brush strokes as well in language?
It's true because it's almost as though I visualize everything. I conceptualize through the visual. I'm like Josh, passionate about art and nature, and I think this is where all of those images come from. And maybe it's an unconscious way of escaping into another reality. But this is has something that I keep on noticing in my work, and more particularly now that I am reviewing a new manuscript. I surprise myself. I'm surprised of the way that this is a a consistent either obsession or theme or way of looking at the world.
Yes,
Hedy,
and I'm just curious about the process that you underwent while writing the first poem, Obsessive Compulsion. You mentioned that you took some time to actually try to put it down into writing that experience, right? That was the experience of acute pain on the part of your son. How long did it take you to write that from the time of the accident?
I would say, I don't remember now, maybe a few
Okay.
months. And I did have this obsessive compulsion of cutting my split hair facing the magnifying mirror. And I would at the same time meditate or think. It was maybe related to that trauma or something that I used to do from time to time, but that became obsessive. So yeah, it just dawned one day. I was talking to another poet and I was talking about the difficulties of writing. I went through a little dry period and couldn't talk about what was most important. And he said, I just said, if you talked about it, and he said, why don't you talk about it as though it was someone else's experience?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how it happened. I knew a woman. So it was a way of creating another mirroring in addition to the actual mirroring in the magnifying mirror, trying to project my worst fears of what might have happened and what really did happen, which, what really did happen was traumatic enough, but a mother's fears are always multiplied by 100.
For sure. And then, so in the course of writing, you were bracketing your emotions. You were objectifying that experience of the mother with an ailing son. Yeah, so that's amazing. And were there some other poems that came out of that experience?
No,
No,
that
it
was
was
the
the only
only.
one. Okay.
It seems like it came like this. It concentrated all the thoughts and worries that I've had for a long time. Yeah,
Okay.
I rarely write about my children. And so even though, like everybody else, they bring their baggage of worries and anxieties as much as of joy. But when I do, it's only a one-time thing. Like I wrote a poem about we left Lebanon and lost everything after the war. And we had a house in the mountains that we sold. And when my son was in his 20s, he went to Lebanon for the first time after 22 or 23 years. He was a baby when we left. And he visited the house and called us and wanted to buy it. And so I wrote a poem about that. But that was the only poem that I wrote about him.
All right.
So Hedy, what is it like to write about border crossings? When you've lived in different spaces and understood that sort of experience of transitioning, what do you feel about writers who attempt to write these kinds of poems?
Are you talking about border crossing in terms of adjusting to another culture or to another language, or?
Yes, psychological, emotional, intellectual. It could even be an ideological border crossing, into a different space. What do you think?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay, migration in itself is traumatic, isn't it?
Yes.
Could this be about migration?
Yeah, it seems to me that
from Lebanon to the US?
Well, it started in Egypt. I was born and raised.
Okay.
I'm originally
Right.
from Lebanon. I spent my summers in Lebanon, went to Lebanon, studied pharmacy, got married. Then there was the war. We lived in Belgium, in Greece, then came to the States. So it's been moving constantly. And those borders, I can feel them, not only within the countries, but in the different homes that we've lived in every place. We came to Michigan in '81, but spent a year in Arizona before. And so all of those homes where you plant flowers, if not a tree, are ways of grounding yourself, of belonging. And so I've always belonged to everywhere I've lived or tried. And so I think everything I've been writing so far deals with recapturing the past, maintaining alive all the beauty and the love and the joy that I had in Egypt and Lebanon, and at the same time reconciling with all the losses, but at the same time embracing my reality as an American and filtering everything, at the same time creating what I call a syncretic space, not only on the page, but within myself. I welcome all of these parts of me. I grew up with French, mostly Arabic, then English, then Spanish that I taught for 33 years, then Italian, and then I've been studying Mandarin for 6 years. So all of these boundaries are welcome in my being. They enriched me, but at the same time, they helped me escape in alternate worlds several times during the day, whether I want it or not. And that's why everything transcends in my poetry.
All right.
It's amazing how many of our guests tonight feel at home wherever they are, and they are able to create beautiful verses out of their experiences.
Okay, we've got to trundle along. There's so much to be shared. I was going to talk about ekphrasis, but maybe we'll revisit that and then hear from Joseph Stanton as well about ekphrasis later on. All right. But next up, thank you so much, Hedy, for the wonderful sharing. I wish we had like 5 hours or something, you know. But let's hear from
Thanks, Hedy.
Thank you, Hedy. Let's hear from Jason. I have the pleasure of introducing Jason, who lives in Hong Kong. Jason Eng Hun Lee is a mixed British and Chinese Malaysian poet. He has been published in the UK, Hong Kong, Singapore, and was a runner-up for the Melita Hume Prize for his debut collection, Beds in the East, published by Eyewear in 2019. He is a literary editor for Post-Colonial Text and the current organizer for Poetry Out Loud Hong Kong. He lectures at Hong Kong Baptist University. So, Jason, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here to share all these wonderful poems about trauma, and I think especially recovery. What I'll do then is I'll read firstly the poem that is collected in the anthology, Paper Cranes. I've been kind of umming and ahhing over whether I should read a poem from my first collection, Beds in the East, or rather whether I should read a more recent unpublished poem, which is very much located in Hong Kong in the here and now. And I think probably I will tend towards the latter, which has a kind of ekphrastic start. So I'll read Paper Cranes first, and then perhaps I'll explain it, and then I'll move on to Sunset at Nan Lian. Paper Cranes. Already you are circling the edges of your sleep, wrestling with those restless, endless shapes from your dreams, before rising to ungirdle your neck and flap towards the iron shutters, as though you might be set free. Outside, the birds are clamoring for you, flightless boy. But since you cannot join them or be set loose from this dour cage, since you cannot tread that still marble lake or pace the corridor of migration with them, do not fret or worry. For I will make you paper cranes, lines of cranes dangling in miniature from every nook and eyrie of this ward, 1,000 cranes serenely poised around you and folded and pressed sensitively, so that when you part the curtains with a great swoosh of your wings to contemplate your freedom, they too will flutter towards each open window. They too will accompany you in all your bitter memorials, strutting back and forth with agile movement. And it will not count for nothing to think something so beautiful could be made from paper strips, beads, and string. For as you rise from your restless bed to speak of their angled elegance and immortality, the rigid wires will uncoil themselves as they hold you in shimmering beaks, ready to lift your cumbersome shape upwards above yourself into a weightless sky. So that's paper cranes. I think some of you guys know that in Japanese culture, often they will fold through origami 1,000 cranes. That practice is called senbazuru. This was a poem for a friend who was at one point at death's door, my best friend in the UK, who was diagnosed with something called aplastic anemia. So this was my attempt to try and cheer him up. He survived, thankfully, and he was also the best man at my wedding a year later. So I was very happy with that conclusion. The second poem that I have it's actually an ekphrastic poem in a sense, because it was commissioned by Hedy and Joshua Ip. Many of you guys know Joshua. It was part of a project called the Hong Kong-Singapore Travel Bubble. So I wanted to find and write a poem about this idea of self-healing. In Hong Kong, we've had more than just COVID. We've had a lot of protests. We've had a lot of tension within the community. So I wanted to write a poem about how me as a person, as a poet, could find some kind of retreat. So I wrote this at a particular place, which is set in the middle of Hong Kong, but very much follows the traditions of a kind of Buddhist garden. So it's called Sunset at Nan Lien. At day's end, you find your way here again, as if in ghostly afterthought, unburdening yourself at the temple gates in slow ritual easing of your fears. And why have you come here? What do you seek in these bowers that call you from yourself? Between columns of stone and bonsai trees, you repeat familiar paths round the mind's pavilion. All is in order here. All is set right. The wind coursing gently across rooftops, the strength of stone up against banyan and pine, the clouds all white and luminous. And after the sun descends, even the cricket stops to dwell in the eeriness. The shadows fall as roots thicken beneath your feet, and the lily pond engulfs you in its solitude. And you find yourself truly alone at last, at the center of your world, wondering at the point of it all, the love and pain you keep locked within you still. The zither and flute from loudspeakers lower to conspiratorial echo, bringing forth past sorrows and remembrances. Is this your own song breaking free from your head? Still, your elegies will not come out of hiding. Beyond, no distant mountains now, but human tenements, 1,000 souls trapped like fireflies in their own lights, lost and helpless against the night's infinite gloom. You turn, wondering if you will ever find your peace. And then, despite the imperfection of your surroundings, you sense it. The slanting rock, the rushing waters, the symmetry of branches bowing in submission. Between the harmony of this wood and the monumental numbness you have suffered, you can no longer deny the keening of your heart, what you feel inside this raging city. Okay, thank you very much, guys.
Wow. Jason, thank you so much for that lovely poem. Can you tell us a bit about what it's like to use, a poem that is also about healing, but also potentially for it to be a kind of political poetry? What are your thoughts on the ability for the lyric to be political?
Well, I think for quite a number of us now in Hong Kong, most of our writing cannot be overtly political. For myself as an artist, as somebody who has a particular kind of aesthetic, I never really tended towards the overtly political anyway. But certainly within the community, we have no choice, right? With the national security law, we cannot express ourselves as we might have done in the past. And I've been doing a lot of readings around the world, and I feel very privileged to have been able to do that. But one thing I keep on banging on about as a kind of spokesperson and gatekeeper for one of the poetry community events, Poetry Out Loud, is this importance of retaining your right to speak, even if you have to find other ways of doing it. And for me, with what I hope will be the second collection, Hong Kongopoly, you'll see a lot of very wistful poems that express this sense of loss, but also the kind of the strength that one gets from being able to self-express. And this, I think, is what will save us. It will save me as a person. And it's something that I've been quite eager to present to some of my friends, who, for want of a better word, are kind of, they've lost hope. And I think hope can never be lost. And I think the art form and the written word and the spoken word, no less, can enable these kinds of self-transformation and self-healing. And that's probably why I decided to read this poem, because for me, it recalls my moments when during the evening after work, on my way home, if I'm feeling kind of lost, I would go to this very beautiful garden and I'd kind of meander around and lose myself to nature. And I think that that's something that quite a lot of us can experience. And it's still possible to do in Hong Kong, despite the built up environment. There are places where one can kind of dip into the self and try to find some kind of, rejuvenation, as it were.
Nice. Thank you, Jason. And can you share with us, because we have a lot of sort of budding writers who will be watching this as well. Tell us a bit about your process of actually shaping and crafting a poem. Do you go into the garden and come out and then, like Keats, you've got a poem already in your head because you're a genius? Or do you sort of first let it all out on the page and then you go back to it, days after or even months after? Just share with us your process. Right?
Well, in this particular case, because it was a commissioned poem, I basically had a week to get the damn thing ready. And that's good for me because I pontificate, I spend forever, it broils around in my head. In the case of this poem, because it's something that's so current, it was easier for me to tap into it. So I went to this place, I kind of documented it through photographs and kind of little video. And then I went back and I reconstructed the experience and I tried to kind of make the poem speak through the experience. So in perhaps years past when I was so focused on things like the imagery or making sure that the poem's verbosity came out, in this case, I was thinking more about the emotions. And I think that's how I've grown as a poet. I feel more in tune with the poem rather than thinking about trying to make it impressive for others. So this poem was very much for myself at its moment of inception. And of course, later on, it picks up a life of its own. So my kind of advice to people doing this kind of thing, if you're writing out of a sense of trauma, then you can just rely on the emotions and the feelings that you have for yourself. And everything else will follow, I think.
Wow. Thank you so much for that wisdom. Eric, do you have anything for Jason?
I like the way you see beauty in public housing when you see them as fireflies at night. And you are correct. Hong Kong is such a beautiful place, urban as it is. It's actually bigger than, probably double the size of Singapore. And you've got plenty of gardens and islands that are pristine still. It's such a comforting place, even if you're under a lot of stress at the moment. right?
Yeah.
And we are with you
Yeah.
as you try to go on with life and with art.
Yeah, and
Thank
we had the wonderful honor of having Jason come down for the Singapore Writers Festival
Yes, he
some
was
years ago, and
here.
you read from that
I
first
remember
book,
that. Yeah.
Jason, right? And you
Yes.
signed my copy of it. So that so it's lovely that we heard a poem from that. And Hedy was telling me on Facebook just the other day that she was in Singapore in 1981. That's a very long time ago. And I wrote back and said I was 10 years old then, and our subway hadn't even started operating. It only started in 1987, what we call the MRT here. So it's nice to know that we're hearing from people from all over the world who have some connection to our small little island. So thank you, Jason, for sharing. It's such an important poem that you shared with us, and we look forward to seeing it in print when it comes out in your book.
Well, the second one is already actually out in print.
Okay.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's part of the Hong Kong Singapore travel bubble. I don't know if you want to do a plug-in for Joshua and Eddie. It's part of the Singlit. It's part of the Singlit commission. But I didn't get the chance to read it in public, so this is my kind of way of making up for that.
Yay!
Wonderful.
Thank you, Jason. All right, so let's have our next distinguished reader, and it's Carolyn. So, Eric, would you like to introduce Carolyn for us?
Yeah, with pleasure. Carolyn Kreiter-Foronda is the Virginia Poet Laureate Emerita, and she has co-edited 3 anthologies and published 9 books, including These Flecks of Color, New and Selected Poems, and The Embrace, the winner of the Art and Literature, the Mary Lynn Coutts Award. Her poems appear widely throughout the United States and abroad in such journals as Nimrod, Perry Schooner, Poet Lore, World Poetry Yearbook, Universal Oneness, and the best of literary journals. Right, so Carolyn?
Thank you so much. And I really am grateful to you, Eric, and also to Desmond for hosting this event and inviting me to read with so many accomplished writers. I've loved hearing them share their work. The 2 poems that I'm going to share are about a near-death experience I had as a teenager. And it was an experience that significantly changed my life. The Healing. In sleep, I saw the muddy water covering my feet and rising. A sign of illness, my mother warned, and in dream after dream, the turbulent waters deepened. When I fell ill that sultry summer 30 years back, the marigolds lost their scent and withered. Near death came, and I rose into a cream-colored sky, hovered over the bed, the room airless. The miracle came in an old-fashioned courtesy call from the family doctor, life being simple and honest. Always my luck has startled me. This morning, for example, the cat, sensing sadness, jumps into my lap and needs his paws, so I will praise him. A little gift, my mother called it, whenever the habitual turned wondrous. I pat the cat's sleek fur, the purring so close to what I am feeling, his lick cleansing my forearm, and in the distance, the doctor's careful hold as he lifts me from the bed. I've been an educator for over 50 years, and I've witnessed firsthand the healing power of poetry. What happened to me after I had the near-death experience is that I decided I am going to give to others. And I've been in homeless shelters in the Washington, D.C. area and worked with the emotionally challenged. I've worked in nursing home settings. And what happened here was just amazing because I worked with people who had Alzheimer's, and they wrote poetry. They came out of their fog and they created poems that were absolutely indelible. They were able to touch the outside world. And I was invited to present at the Virginia Academy of Family Physicians conference a poem that I wrote that's called The Goodness of the Physician. And this is the second poem that I will share. 1. Family physicians treat everyone, farmers, executives, the deaf, the blind, patients who live in mansions, those who sleep on city streets, a traveler stricken by malaria, or a hiker bitten by a rabid fox. They confront each diagnosis with steely resolve. Long into night, they consult medical records and books, convinced the cure for a dying child lies hidden in a family secret. Perhaps an epileptic grandmother embarrassed by her seizures. Perhaps a great aunt locked in a room chanting a stream of unintelligible words. They know it takes a miraculous moment to connect the dots, the payoff big like the clamor of sun after a storm. 2. I know about the miracles doctors perform. I was 16. It was August, the steamy air thick with flies and dust. Inside, the air conditioner spit and groaned. Close by, I lay on a makeshift bed. Feverish, I climbed out of my body, floated to the ceiling, looked down on my mother leaning over me. Like Norman Rockwell's country physician making rounds after hours, our doctor arrived unannounced. It took generosity for him to stop by the house, quick thinking to place me in a tub of icy water, and wisdom to send me to the hospital, where I beat the odds. Occasionally, the doctors may feel they don't know everything, yet I am here, drinking in rivers of air, because one did. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carolyn, for those poems.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask, how important is it in your healing process to be friends with your doctors? So they appear quite prominent in the poems that you read for us tonight.
Yes, that's an excellent question. It's extremely important because then I feel that I can say anything to them about whatever ailments I may be having. Now, Dr. Joseph Haven Hogue was the one who saved me, and his daughter was one of my best friends. And I was very close to the son, and I'm still close to the grandchildren. In fact, we're going up for a celebration tomorrow with one of them. I just never got away from this family, because they were always there to support me. And I was growing up in a small town outside of the Richmond area, and everyone was close. My parents were parents to other children. I mean, we just grew up being there for each other. And for Dr. Hogue to stop by the house was just amazing. Now, now that I'm down here in a rural area, I have a physician who's very well known. He's now prominent to the National Organization of Family Physicians. And he has just been very, very supportive. He asked me to write the second poem that I shared about my near-death experience.
Okay. And you are obviously a cat lover.
Oh, yes.
How has the pleasure of having a loving cat helped you recover from that near-death experience?
Yes, just being surrounded by animals. I mean, you can tell, I mentioned earlier about our wildlife retreat, and we now have a stray cat that is living in our garage and another stray cat that's living inside the house. And there's just have the healing power. It was amazing how I just curled up in bed with our cats. And back then, when I was growing up, we ended up with 21 cats. They just kept having babies. Right, exactly. And when
I just thought my mom keeps about 13 cats in our garage back home. It 13 is just a small number compared to that.
Well, anything we can do to help animals. And as I said earlier, to help others. That's what life is all about. Look what you're doing for us. You're giving of yourself, of your time. And those are the people that I greatly admire in life.
And we're also very grateful to you, Carolyn, for your generosity.
Thank you so much.
Carolyn,
Thank
I'm going to jump in with a question, Carolyn.
Okay.
You talk about giving back, and you've gone to work with the homeless and gone to nursing homes. Can you give us some pointers on what it's like to work with communities like this, the sort of sensitivity that's needed, even as you're a trained poet, to sit with their writing, and how do you guide them? How do you guide these workshops with them?
Yes, that's another excellent question. It's really important to sit and listen.
Mm.
To listen to what these people have to say so that you get to know them.
Mm.
And then to take whatever it is that they create in a first draft, and I'm the type, like others today have mentioned, I write and revise constantly. And I tell them that. I say, put those words down on the page and let's share them, and then I can help them move forward. And they feel comfortable because I point out what works. I point out the positivity of what they're producing and try to concentrate on that rather than on anything else, and concentrate on who they are. A blessing that I've been given is that I can read people extremely well. And that's been very helpful when I've gone into these facilities to help others. And then I leave, it's like a way to deal with, curing yourself. It's healing, just like your anthology is healing for all of us.
Thank you, Carolyn. You're so kind. Thank you.
Yeah,
And thank you for doing the work
you're
you
so
do.
motherly.
Oh, thank you.
I wish my postgraduate supervisors were all like that. We're all like you.
You're so kind. Well, I do keep in touch with all of my students.
Great.
As many as possible through Facebook. You all were mentioning that, or through emails, telephone calls. It's really important.
Yeah. Eric just talked about his doctorate. He just completed his doctorate at NTU, and it was about poetry and trauma. So he has all these amazing references on on the interstices between trauma and poetry as a healing art. But anyway, I see Jendi Reiter in the house. Jendi, thank you for joining us early. I know that you are rushing home just to get to us. Hi, Jendi.
Hi there. Good morning from Massachusetts and good evening in Singapore. I just gave my son breakfast, and now I am here enjoying poetry from around the world. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jendi.
Thanks for being here.
Yes, we're making good time. We are going to hear from dear David R. James. And Eric, can you help us introduce David, please?
Yeah, sure. So D.R. James's latest of 9 collections are Flip Requiem, published by Dos Madres, 2020, and Surreal Expulsion, published by Poetry Box in 2019, and If God Were Gentle, also by Dos Madres, 2017. And he has a micro chapbook. All her jazz is free, fun, and printable for folding at Origami Poems Project. He lives in the woods near Saugatuck, Michigan. And D.R. James, you've got the floor.
Wonderful. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I often forget to demute.
That's right.
Well, thanks to everyone. Thanks, Des and Eric, very much. And welcome from Saugatuck, Michigan, which is on the west side of the state along Lake Michigan. My name is David, even though I go by DR for my poems. And I don't do that to be uppity, like T.S. Eliot or something like that. It's because there's another David James poet on the east side of Michigan, and he got our name first. And but the saving grace is he's older than me and balder than me. So, but anyway, I have to go by DR to distinguish myself. I'm going to read the poems in the anthology, and then which are actually trauma poems. But in order not to leave on the dark note, I'm going to read an extra poem, which is on the healing side. This first poem reflects the pre-verbal trauma of an infant through 2 surgeries, newborn and at 2 years, which is echoed forward into adulthood. Ugly duckling. If he could think, scarcely sensation circuits so far, this would make no sense. Only hours old, he has had anesthesia, then unmitigated pain, days of crying alone. What about that amniotic promise of new skin on skin, new mouth on breast, tiniest brain emboldened in the formative moments by a mother and a father, their faces circling like clouds? Instead, this duplicity, amygdala overloaded. If he could predict this will happen again, a second surgery to improve the nose and lip line, he will be 2 new faces circling below a bright ceiling, before the black mask, the gas, before he doesn't remember. Big people with big hands will do this to him, and he will forever after imagine ether. Days later, alone again in a sandbox, not yet allowed to bend his splinted arms. Over and over, he will want to touch where it intermittently throbs, where it stitches 2 little pillows, the swollen flesh shining, imprinting complete. This next poem responds to adults' trauma from their infant's elongated death. Hospice report. My wife comes home cold, slides into bed to warm against my sleepiness, and sighs. At snow, I drove through everything. To the toddler who never walked, and every Friday for 18 months beyond predictions, his slack presence swaddled on the living room couch. Encephalitis, nothing wrong with that little heart. Though the tiny mothers had broken long ago, and now her nonstop sobbing, her husband posted like friendly stone, the older brothers already back in bed. She'd held him dead for 2 hours before the nurse could carry him outside. How are you? I whisper, my wife's body beginning to settle. Always sad for them, but happy for the baby, who was too big for the funeral man's basket, small enough to stow beside him on the seat. This next poem imagines the post-trauma of a young Marine. Still, it all recurs for the maimed, how they remain, or don't, atop the plots of the buried. Those who could do something table the question. They relax in the rocker of their certainty. A war, any war, an abstraction that walls off the bursting specifics. A 20-something friend found he'd deployed to sort body parts. A raid, they'd survive the fever sweeping a land we could never know. Welcomed by the white-blue atrium of a foreign sky, he'd prowl his perimeter until his duty tapped him. Then the oven sun would relight his nightmare, the categories of bone and flesh, his production line. What achievement could signal his success? What dream in the meantime could relieve raw nerve? The perfect tour would end when he was still in one piece. A nation's need ignoring the gore behind the games, the horror nestling into the still living because still in one piece. So like I said, I wanted to end on lighter note. This is the title poem from the book, one of the books mentioned, Flip Requiem. It relays an amused resignation in later years that is a kind of healing. And again, it's the title poem of my most recent collection. Flip Requiem. Only black and tan clumps cling anymore to our oaks, raking, finally making sense, which stand silent as pickets this side of winter's no longer fierce or precise approach. I'm over a father's death, an angry mother's post-mortem reach, though there it is again. The delusion that autumn's demise warns us of anything. Those fears fading, their threatening hues, mere harmless colors after all. Instead, a dogwood's scrawny pecs spread stripped limbs to greet us into the new season's breach, a wind-scrambled blueprint of tangled twigs, leaf eddies, and rain. What's to come used to command such aching concentration, demands collected in the heart. Now, subdued, it signals no sad story tracking itself across some dismal arena dressed in black elegiac notes, but noodles muted scales that free the blood and coast us toward a more cordial space. A flip requiem, perhaps, for chronic requiems. Voila.
Wow. Thank you very much for that, DR.
You're
And I'm
welcome.
just curious, what's the inspiration behind your work? There's plenty of twisted, broken bodies there in the poems that you read tonight.
I pretty much ran the table on my twisted body poems when I sent these in. So I don't typically focus on that sort of thing. These things simply occurred to me, and I don't typically set out to say something in particular. There's an instance perhaps that I want to write about, and then I let the poem lead me on, both in terms of what I'm saying, but oftentimes more importantly or more powerfully, how I'm saying it. So sound really leads me on as well.
So some of these persona poems are actually the product of your imagination. DR.
The second poem, the third poem, yes. The third poem.
Okay.
I mean, I knew the 20-something friend.
All right.
He didn't talk much about it, and so I was imagining what could be going on in him, probably taking liberties. I'm not sure. He never saw the poem, so he might say you're full of it, David. I don't know. The first poem is about me, but it's pre-verbal, so I can only imagine how that eventually has affected me.
Really?
Yeah, and the second poem is about my wife, and you know, she kept me pretty informed, so I think that's fairly accurate.
And as you write about these experiences, some of which are not your own, how responsible do you feel towards these people, towards your subjects, as you write about them?
Well, first two poems I'm pretty good about, not too worried about it. The third one, the young man was actually our daughter's boyfriend at the time, and I did worry a little bit. So I ran it by her, and she said he would be fine with this poem. I didn't get a chance actually to run it past him before he disappeared from her life. So it's a bit tougher to figure that one out. I feel like while it springs from a specific young man and his duties, I universalized it enough so that it would perhaps represent more people's experience. Certainly represents my reaction to such an experience.
Yes.
That's for sure.
And it's a very bold act to try to empathize with people who are probably far removed, you know, in terms of experience from yourself.
Yeah,
Right.
I was a bit nervous about it. I feel okay about it now, especially because I ran it by our daughter. So, and she had talked to him a lot about that experience. So she said, I'm pretty sure he'd be okay with it.
Yeah, wonderful. And yeah, perhaps there are many other readers out there who have the same experience and can relate to what you're writing about. Right. And I was just wondering, there are shades of Guernica in Still. It's very cinematic, also quite abstract. Like how important this ekphrasis for you? Yeah. Yes.
Well, we talked before about political poems, and I forget
yes.
who said it, but and
it was
maybe
Jason.
Right, and but I forget who said this comment, which is all poems are political. But perhaps I believe that also because I'm a privileged white guy. I don't know. But this one definitely came out of a more political period in my poetry writing. So it's definitely shafting the powers that be who don't so often seem to care about what's going on for the young people. I love the idea that if politicians' kids would be drafted, there wouldn't be any wars. So
all right. And like from your
Thank you for
standpoint,
sharing that.
how is it important? How important is it for poets to be committed to certain causes, say politics?
Well, I think I would say they have to have a pretty good view on what they're writing about. Unfortunately, as Adrienne Rich pointed out, a whole lot of lousy poetry, Denise Levertov also, a whole lot of lousy poetry comes out of being political. So the first and most important quality of a political poem, if it's going to be a poem, is that it's a poem, not just that it's expressing some political view. You know, I don't know, maybe this is naive, but anybody could write a political thing, but it's less likely that it's going to be a poem.
Nice.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you so much, David.
You're welcome.
Spot on.